think now everyone should be there. Zoom sometimes takes some time. Thank you so much for joining this industry briefing. As you have probably noticed also, I'm super excited about this industry briefing also because I think it's a really, really interesting topic. We haven't talked too much about it. I actually did like a short Google research again about SolarTech and realized there's not too much on that term. So perhaps we could even like use this as our name and brand it. With more knowledge. So yeah, happy also to hand over quickly to Max, who's today's speaker. Max is part of the investment team at First Momentum. He has a PhD in physics. And actually, yeah, started or tried himself also to found a startup, mega loop-like cargo transport, but also he worked with super tiny antennas. That's always what I remember. So he's really the person at First Moment also for hardware and really deep tech topics. So yeah, happy to hand over to you, Max.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So let me just talk in English. I think everybody's German, but for the recording, we can just continue in English. And maybe, can I share my screen? I think that would be...
You should be able.
Ah, yes, perfect. It's much easier. So you can see all of this, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Okay. Then let me kick it off. So as Lena said today for the briefing, I chose the topic solar energy and solar tech. I chose this because I think this is interesting for different reasons. Actually, first of all, solar energy is like a very relevant topic. It's a strongly growing market. There are a lot of like tech improvements that we're seeing. We are also seeing a lot of startups, also German startups, that try to enter the market. And I think that we are about to see a paradigm shift in the solar tech field as well. Like the way we turn sun energy into useful energy is going to change a little bit in the future. And I think this is quite exciting. So I thought about, hey, let's share it with you guys. So first of all, I will kick it off and show you some numbers just to show you where we are with solar energy and then where we might be going in the future. And then because I want to talk a little bit about tech, I want to quickly explain to you on a very high level how solar cells work and what are the limitations here, and then how we can overcome these limitations, and we can look at a few interesting startups as well. So let's start with the numbers. Only in the last decade alone, solar has experienced an annual a growth of 24-25%. You can see here on the left, this is the solar power generation worldwide for China, US, Europe, India, Germany, UK. You can see that over the last decade, there was a really exponential growth in solar power generation, which is mainly driven by China, by the US, and recently also by India. Europe's growth here is not as strong as it used to be. If you look at the share of electricity production from solar, you can actually see that Germany is doing quite good in the international comparison. We are even above 10% now, and the worldwide average is more around 4%, a little bit higher than 4%. And just to give you a feeling for some numbers here, if we want to decarbonize our energy sector by 2050, which is this net zero emission target that was published by the International Energy Agency, and a lot of like large industrial countries are trying to aim for that. And then we have to increase these 1,200 terawatt hours that we currently have to over 7,000 terawatt hours by 2030, just to be on a good track to decarbonize the energy sector in 2050. And this means that by 2030, we should actually have annual additions of solar PV capacity of 630 gigawatts. And to put this in perspective, currently our global solar capacity is 880 gigawatts, which means that by 2030, we actually have to take all the solar energy that we have today, and we have to add this again every year, a little bit less, but almost that again every year. So it's like, you can see that we have a lot of solar right now. It's growing strongly, but we need much more to decarbonize energy by 2050. And I think most countries have also realized this. They also realized that solar energy is actually relatively cheap. And so US, China as well, India, EU obviously as well, they all have strong policy support to push solar energy. And yeah, one of the reasons this is so, let's say, solar energy is so cheap is because the prices per panel per watt have declined significantly over the last, what is it here, 30 years, from $10 per watt to below 30 cents per watt, which is mainly driven actually by China. So that's actually a positive development, if you want, because most solar panels are developed in China. They have access to the cheapest, not so clean energy, but it allows them to make very cheap solar cells. So that's like a positive. But of course, on the other side, the insane level of congestion in the solar industry, the fact that most of the, let's say, solar supply chains are concentrated in China, this is also concerning on the other hand. So China has invested like 50 billion, or I think now it's even more, in PV supply capacity, which is 10 times more than Europe. And they are dominating basically all important areas of solar cell production. That starts here in this figure on the right. Polysilicon is basically the raw material for 95% of the solar cells, and also for like electronics and semiconductor industry. And then you turn this into wafers, silicon wafers, important for solar cells and electronics. And then you make solar cells, and then you stack them together to modules. And China has a market share above 75% in all these 4 areas, which far exceeds their own demand, of course. So they basically produce for the rest of the world. The other big producers are actually like APEC. This is mainly Vietnam and I think Thailand. And I think it's fair to say that most of the production sites in Vietnam are owned by Chinese companies as well. So the actual market share is even higher than these 75% for modules and I think 80% for cells. And the interesting thing is that this trend is even increasing. So although China has already most of the market share here, they are still increasing their market share every year because they have the like cheapest energy, or let's say not just cheap energy, but also cheap labor. So their costs per panel are much lower than what we have here or what we could offer here in Europe. And on top of that, China is not just producing all cells and the raw materials for cells, but they also host the 10 largest companies that produce cell manufacturing equipment. And then on top of that, they also have like companies that build, battery storage and inverters and everything that you need to make use of solar energy. But that's maybe a bit too much to talk about today. But so what I'm just trying to say is that China basically dominates the entire solar supply chain. And even, that's quite interesting, even within China, you have a strong congestion of solar cell fabrication because most solar cells are fabricated within 2 Chinese provinces. I think 1 out of every 7 panels is produced in the same facility. So they just have a few mega facilities. And then they have a bunch of coal power plants that just produce energy for these solar factories. And this is why they can produce these solar cells for such cheap money. Obviously, because as I said, they use coal power plants. So it's typically a discussion, hey, how green are solar cells actually? Because you use all the coal to fabricate them, and you need a lot of heat and temperature to turn silicon into wafers and so on. But still, solar cells are actually quite good in this regard. So they only need like 4 to 8 months to offset all the manufacturing emissions, which compared to the lifetime, I think is quite fine. Then let's maybe quickly talk about how solar cells are made, or not how they're made, but like how they work, and then what their shortcomings are. So this is a sketch of like very, very basic solar cell. So it starts with an anti-reflective coating, obviously, because you don't want to reflect light, you want to absorb it. Then you have electrodes. These are the top electrodes, this kind of grid here, that's typically silver. You have a bottom electrode, which is this very thin gold layer here. This is typically aluminum. And then in between these electrodes, you have a semiconducting material, typically polycrystalline silicon. And so if you look closer, you see that we actually have a black area and a red area, which means that we have two slightly different and modified types of silicon, which is like important. Yeah, you cannot just put a block of silicon there, but you have to modify the electronic properties of the silicon a little bit and then stack two different types together. And then when photons hit the silicon, there are some electrons in the silicon that can absorb photons, so light particles. And once they absorb the light, these electrons are excited to a higher energy state. And in this higher energy state, these electrons become more mobile and they're not bound to the silicon atoms so much anymore. So they can move around more freely in a current, basically. And if we apply a voltage between this top and bottom electrode, for example, here at the top, there is a positive field, then we can attract the electrons to the top electrode and create a current. And this current is then basically our output and is able to drive whatever, a machine or something, yeah. And so this is how a solar cell works. The most important property of the silicon here is its band gap. The band gap is basically the energy difference between the electron before it absorbs the photon, the light, and after it absorbs the light. And this band gap is set, it's fixed for the material, and it's like 1.12 electron volts, which is around 1,100 nanometers in wavelength. So this means that silicon can absorb, so 1,100 nanometers wavelength is like near infrared light. Every light that has a higher energy than near infrared, so which is basically all optical visible light, can be absorbed by silicon. Everything that has an energy lower than that cannot be absorbed. And so if we look at the solar spectrum looks a little bit like this. So this here is basically the whole solar spectrum. This is wavelength. Shorter wavelength means higher energy. So energy increases here to the left. 500 is blue light, 530 is green light, 630 is red light, and 750 onwards is infrared, basically. So we cannot absorb all of this pinkish light here. This has too low energy. It's not enough to kick the electron from its ground state to the excited state. All of this here on the left can be absorbed. However, if the light has an energy that is too high, for example, a blue photon, most of the energy actually is lost as heat, yeah, because the electron can only take up so much energy and all the excess energy has to go somewhere. So it's usually heat and we cannot deal with that. So we lose all of this blue stuff. The orange stuff here is lost by material, imperfections, basically. And what remains is this yellow part. This is the part that actually our solar cell could, in theory, absorb. And so this is basically a theoretical limit for all solar cells, which is around 30% of the light. So meaning that 30% of the light that comes in can be transferred into something useful for us. And it cannot be better than that if we just take a, let's say, traditional solar cells. And actually the practical efficiency of solar cells is even a bit lower than 30%. It's, let's say, around 21% for the most common silicon solar cells. There's a way to improve this all the way to 25%. There are some things, you can do some incremental improvements. For example, you can add a reflective layer here on the bottom of the solar cell. So all the light that goes through the cell and is not absorbed is reflected, and then you get basically an extra chance for absorption. So this increases the efficiency by like 1% or so, which is cool, but it's not like, it's an incremental improvement. It's not like a significantly, making the world a better place. So for this, we would really need a paradigm shift to push the efficiency beyond 30%. And this is actually what people want, because so it's what we need, more solar energy. This is what I meant earlier. And there are like a few ways to do it. Obviously, like you can build more solar plants and you need to reduce costs to make this attractive. But of course, if you could increase the energy that a single cell can produce for the same cost, then this is a win, obviously. So people try to push this efficiency beyond 30% all the way to 50% actually. But with silicon, this is, or let's say with pure silicon, this is not going to happen. Okay, then maybe let's talk a bit about things that can be done and how the next generation of solar cells could look like. There's one thing I would actually like to discuss first, and that's has nothing to do with the silicon itself, because next to silicon, there's actually another important resource, and that is the silver that is used for these top electrodes here. Currently, 10% of all the silver that is mined is used for solar cells. And if solar energy is increasing like so rapidly as it should, then we think that by 2030, 30% of all the silver that is currently mined will be used for solar cells. Yeah, obviously, like in the future, you might mine a bit more silver, but the silver that is mined today, 30% of that amount would be used for solar cells only. And this then brings some other issues with it, like dependencies, potential cost issues. And so there are quite a few companies and also startups that try to look for silver alternatives for the electrodes. So they have the same electrode, same solar cell, but they just want to replace the electrode material. So for example, there's a PB2+. This is a spin-off actually from Fraunhofer Institute. They have also a lot of solar cell research. And here they have the idea to replace the silver with copper, which is more abundant, cheaper, and might even be better performance, or like offer better performance. Sixonia is another startup. They're from Dresden. They do something more fancy. They are developing graphene ink for graphene-based electrodes. Basically the same idea here. And I think all of this is quite relevant, because I can imagine that in the future, if solar is really growing so fast, and silver might become a bottleneck. But from an investor perspective, I'm a bit skeptical when it comes to these startups, because they all have to integrate themselves into existing supply chains. So they either have to so they probably all have to build machines that solar cell manufacturers can introduce into their fabrication lines to produce solar cells. And all of these customers, they're sitting in China. So this is, like, from an investor perspective, a bit difficult. I also don't think that these are the startups that could really explode. I'm more interested in the ones that try to reinvent the solar cell from ground up, basically. And to do this, to basically build a completely new solar cell, make it better, make it cheaper, we have no other choice but to think about replacing silicon. And I think companies that find a way to do that, they have a very good chance of getting very, very big in the future. And so let's maybe look at a few options that we have to replace silicon and build completely new solar cells that work in principle in the same way than the one I just explained to you, but without the silicon. And one option is organic solar cells, huge hype topic, like, I don't know, 10 years ago, everybody was working on it. They offer very low cost solar cells, but they also offer very low stability and efficiency, which is not so great. I think this field actually, the development here really slowed down. So I think there are much better alternatives than organic solar cells. As I said, it was a hype topic 10 years ago, but now the hype is really gone. Then there's cadmium telluride. This is a bit different candidate because these solar cells are cost competitive with silicon, which is very important. But cadmium is super toxic. Telluride is very limited in supply. Still, there is one very big company. You might have heard of it. It's called First Solar. They're also publicly traded, like 19 billion market cap. They are building cadmium telluride solar cells, actually. And then another alternative would be gallium arsenide. They are actually very good. They have the perfect band gap for the solar cell spectrum. They have the highest efficiency so far with like 29%, very high thermal stability. The problem is that gallium arsenide is ultra toxic. This makes it also very expensive to use. And so currently it's limited to space applications. So all satellites, spaceships, and so on, their solar cells are typically gallium arsenide because they don't care about the costs. They just want to have the best solar cells possible. However, there's one more material that is outperforming all these other options and also silicon, and this is perovskite. And this is now the paradigm shift that I was talking about earlier. Perovskites are a class of minerals. There are a lot of different perovskites, and they have very interesting electronic properties. Some of them are semiconducting, and they can be used for solar cells. And the fabrication of such perovskite solar cells is quite simple, quite cheap, and eco-friendly. Because what you have to do is you just mix these perovskites in your chemistry lab. It's like in ink, and then you print this ink on a surface, and you just wait, and it hardens out. And this all happens at room temperature. So, you know, compared to silicon, you would need to mine silicon, then you need to melt the silicon and create wafers, and you need super high temperatures for this, a lot of energy. And for perovskite, it all happens at room temperature. Perovskites, they're also very sensitive, so you don't need a very thick layer, you just need a very thin layer of perovskite, and you can print it on any surface. You can make very lightweight solar cells, even flexible solar cells if you want to. And all of this, depending on who you talk to, means that you can make solar cells 3 to 10x cheaper per watts compared to silicon. And also perovskites, they cover a wider range of photons, so they can absorb a larger spectrum of photons of light much better than silicon. So this means they also offer much higher efficiencies of already now 24 to 25%. This, for example, was done at the University of Stuttgart. I think we have very, very good research here in Germany, by the way. So they are really world class. A solar cell would look something like this, so very like simple schematic. It's actually like similar structure than before. We have a top contact, we have bottom contact. So this ITO is basically a transparent electrode, and glass is transparent as well. So light is coming from the bottom. Then we have the perovskite here in the middle, and it's sandwiched between these two layers, which are just performance enhancers to keep it simple. And these kind of solar cells, because they're so cheap, you can print them on any surface. They're so thin. They offer very high efficiencies, even at like shady conditions. So even if it's a bit darker, they work quite well. So you can also enable completely new applications. You could, for example, cover building facades, which is what the Japanese are trying to do, because they don't have so much area for solar. So they're trying to cover their buildings with these solar cells. Actually, these perovskite solar cells were invented in Japan, so they also have quite a good research. And then you could also like replace batteries and IoT sensors, for example, with solar cells, so that they don't need any batteries anymore, because you can make them so small, so lightweight, flexible if needed. The only problem so far, and the reason why we don't use these solar cells yet, is their stability. Yeah, so they are cheaper in production, they have better efficiencies, but they degrade very quickly over time. And this is, of course, a big problem. And I recently spoke to Professor Michael Saliba. He's professor at the University of Stuttgart, also one of the best researchers in this field. He was one of the first researchers actually to start working on these solar cells. He told me that this is actually solved, this problem now. So by choosing the proper materials and proper encapsulation, you can make perovskite solar cells quite stable. And if this is true, and he was not like exaggerating a little bit, then this means that we are probably seeing that these perovskite solar cells are quickly gaining market share over the next 5 to 10 years. Once we scale up production capacity, I think they are so cheap and also better in terms of performance that they will probably quickly gain market share here. And we can even use perovskite to make even better solar cells than these 25%, if we build so-called tandem solar cells. So tandem solar cells are just basically combinations of two different solar cells. So imagine you have one material that, like silicon absorbs the red light very well. And perovskite, actually, it can be tuned to different parts of the visible spectrum. So you can make a solar cell that is better in the blue, and then you combine these two solar cells, and the two of them together absorb then red and blue very well. So together they have even higher efficiencies of around 32%. This was already proven. You can also completely remove the silicon and make tandem solar cells that combine 2 or 3 different perovskite materials. And in theory, you could push the efficiency all the way to 50%, which some companies are trying to do now. Which one to keep an eye on? I think this is also quite interesting. So again, First Solar, this is the company I mentioned before. They make these cadmium telluride cells, they recently bought a Swedish company, Evola, that make perovskite solar cells for around 30 million, I think a little bit less than $30 million, which shows you that they try to get a foot in the door here. One would assume, hey, you're already doing something different than silicon solar cells, so that why don't you bank on cadmium telluride? But it seems like they want to produce perovskite in the future as well. And then we have Cubic PV. They actually build silicon perovskite tandem cells, so they build both the silicon and the perovskite and then stack it together. They have raised 58 million, 33 million in January from Bill Gates Breakthrough Ventures and First Solar again. So they invest again here in their competitors. Celux, they do something similar, but they actually take silicon cells from other players and just cover it with perovskite, basically. So a spin-off from Caltech, they raised 12 million from Khosla Ventures. Then there's Oxford PV. This is a UK and German player, actually. Obviously a Oxford spin-off. Also tandem solar cells. And they are actually, this is quite interesting, they're building a solar cell factory in Brandenburg and have raised 140 million, but to be honest, they're already quite old. They're like 10 years old now. There's also one, I just wanted to mention it for the sake of completeness, one very, very early startup in Germany that is focusing on perovskite. This is the spin-off from the Stuttgart University. So really looking forward what they can build. And yeah, basically to conclude it, I think perovskite is really the best candidate to increase the performance of what's possible with silicon while keeping costs low. And if this stability issue is really solved, then this means that we're really about to see a paradigm shift in the production and development of solar cells. I think it is also an opportunity, and I think the only opportunity of getting significant production market share back to Europe, because we have such a good research in that field, and so we should really utilize that research and build some companies that are turning that research into solar cell manufacturers. So Oxford PV is already a good step. Hopefully we see some more companies that go out and raise some significant funding here. Yeah, so that's it actually from my side. I think now we can kick off the discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Max. Again, mind-blowing presentation. And thanks for presenting all these also really technical details in such an understandable way. I think you always do there a really great job. So yeah, I mean, I would kick off a question round. If anyone has questions, you can raise your hand, or also, yeah, Andy, go ahead.
You mentioned this being the only route back to manufacturing in Germany for solar cells, and I would agree with that. But kind of looking at your list, like why is there so few spin-outs if research is kind of world class in Germany? Is it kind of just the basic German problem of companies or it being hard to spin out of German universities, or do you think there's a different reason?
So to be honest, the companies that are listed, they're the ones I know well, and the ones I've seen. I've not done. It could be actually that there's maybe a few more startups in Germany that I've not seen, because I know that. So maybe first of all, I think the best research and most of the research efforts are probably concentrated around Stuttgart. So the group of Professor Saliba, they are like probably the best in Europe. So and this is where Perosolar is coming from. So that one is checked. Then you have also a lot of research happening at Fraunhofer. They have very good, very large solar institute as well. But I haven't heard, like, for example, PV2+ is coming from there, like the other company that I mentioned here above. I have not heard about a perovskite spin-off there. I know also, for example, in Würzburg, they have good perovskite research, but I know that there's no spin-off there. I don't know why. So yeah.
Maybe one follow up to this? Do you know if there is kind of what the public funding environment for this is, or is kind of all public attention being sucked into hydrogen and kind of being this being seen as the future of clean energy, and like solar is like, oh yeah, we tried this in the 90s, but
yeah, that's actually that is a good question. So so I talked to Professor Saliba, and so he told me that he is now so companies approach him and they ask him. So there are solar companies, they approach him and they say, hey, we would like to get know-how in the field of perovskite. We would like to get a foot in the door. Which startups should we buy? And then he says, yeah, okay, there are not so many startups. And then they're like, okay, how can we get, like, are there any research groups that we can access, or like we can just hire the PhD students or something? So I don't know about the public funding situation, but it seems like that the solar companies already have a strong eye on perovskite, and the perovskite talent is limited. I mean, they're not like growing on trees. So and these solar companies, they're trying to get they try to get a foot in the door. Yeah? They try to buy everything that is doing perovskite, and try to make collaborations with universities. So this Professor Saliba, he already had like a bunch of commercial collaborations before he spun out the company. So there's definitely interest from private players. I don't know about the public landscape. But so I've not heard about a sprint challenge, for example, for solar cells.
Yeah,
it could actually really be that, as you said, we tried this in the 90s and we did it, and then we sold everything to China, and like, why should we do it again? Maybe that is the point. Yeah.
That was actually a question I also would have, is like what role, and also, I mean, for people basically being in the field and thinking about, okay, starting a company, what role does actually the solar crisis play? Is it like in the industry, okay, or I don't want to start something and leave research because it can happen that everything goes down again?
Yeah. So what I know, what also this professor told me, is that for him it is very difficult to convince his PhD students to join his startup, which like might sound weird, right? Because you have like world-class research, and then he's making a startup, but nobody, like, they don't want to join. I don't know. I would say that these guys are too young to like have experienced the solar crisis. So I don't know if that's a reason. But I could imagine that larger investors, they just say, hey, it is unreasonable to think that we can bring a solar production back to Europe. You know, China, they're so cheap, and obviously, like, for silicon, this is true, right? It doesn't make sense to produce solar cells here. I mean, the US is pushing a little bit to get some market share back, but they're mainly focusing on module assembly, so basically the last part of the supply chain. But for Europe, it probably doesn't make sense in silicon. But when it comes to perovskite, because perovskite is in theory so much cheaper, then it makes sense. I'm actually not sure if yeah, it's a good question. So, but as I said before, probably this experience from 20 years ago, it's still there, and it kind of affects the thinking here.
Yeah, any other questions? I have a list of 10, so please go ahead, all the others first, otherwise. Again, Andy.
Interesting.
Where do you see this in terms of kind of TRL, and is this something that you would dive deeper into now to look for investments, or is it more like, yeah, it's still too much research, and kind of the first demonstrators first have to happen or kind of it doesn't make sense to have for VC investments to go into this, because it's kind of similar to the chip industry in the sense of like it's high capex and kind of you have to make it up with or kind of with volume.
So I would actually start looking now, and I mean I've looked at Parasol, so I've actually done it. I think timing is quite good now. What you have to do is, so now what I found out, okay, it might be, or let's say there's a good chance that this stability problem is solved. If the stability problem is solved, what you have to do is you basically have to build up production capacity first, maybe on a smaller scale, and then you have to prove that the stability is solved for higher batches. Like right now, it's solved for like small batches, and then you have to ramp up production, and then you have to prove, okay, stability is there, and then you ramp up production again, prove stability is there. So this probably takes some time, but it's from a like, so I would say the scientific challenges are done, and it's just engineering now and trying to encapsulate it better and kind of make it more stable. At the same time, you see that when you look at the US, like Cubic PV, they raised 33 million this year. That's a good sign. Khosla invested 12 million, or like led a 12 million round in another spin-off from Caltech. I think so big investors are getting involved, so that is a good sign. Oxford PV, I mean, they're already quite old, so they started in 2011, I think, but now they seem to be ready and build a factory in Brandenburg, so I think that's a good sign. What I'm a bit more concerned about, so I really like this field, and I think it has like huge potential. I'm a bit more concerned about that these startups are getting bought too early, like as happened to Evola, the Swedish company. They just got bought for like, it was maybe 25 to 30 million from First Solar, which is like, it's great for the founders, right? I think this company didn't exist for so long. They're still quite young. They are like founded from university, and then somebody comes and says, hey, I give you 30 million for your startup. And then, yeah, awesome. Like, that's great. But so that is a threat that I see from a VC perspective, that more solar players, I don't know, Yinko and it seems like First Solar, they have like invested in other companies as well. They might even make more acquisitions, right? So that is a threat that I'm seeing, and I'm not sure. I'm still not. I'm a bit undecided if this is a too big of a threat. Yeah, if this is a field that makes sense to invest in, because there's an acquisition risk which limits your upside. I think this is my bigger concern, actually. I think from the tech readiness, I think timing is good.
One other question I had heard about like organic PV. Is perovskite actually the organic PV, or no, because it's eco, or is it?
Yeah, perovskite is inorganic. It's like some mineral. They're like bunch of minerals like calcium, titanium oxide, or how you pronounce this. So it's not organic. Like organic solar cells, they're like these polymer carbon based semiconductors. So again, very different class. I know that in Würzburg, a lot of people were working on this. Like when I started my PhD, like my physics studies, it was a very big topic. And then because we have a chair for solar energy, basically, and they started to work on organic solar cells in the beginning. And then once I started my PhD, it was all perovskite, basically.
Oh, okay. And what is the reason, or is it like not a topic anymore? And or what is your take on it?
I think the efficiencies did not increase as good as they thought. And so probably you can make them still much more efficient, like there's still room for improvement, but the development is happening on a slower pace than perovskite. And so they just got outperformed.
Okay. And with perovskite, actually, will we be able to achieve the 2030 and 2050 goals? Do you know that? With the higher efficiency?
So it's a matter of how many solar cell plants we build in the end, right? So I think actually this was also an interesting question that I asked myself. How, because like I'm always talking in efficiencies, right? It's like 21%, and then it's 30%, and then it's 50%. But what does it actually mean for like a solar, like a utility plant? Like if you have a plant that has a size of, I don't know what size, yeah, and then if you increase the efficiency from 21% to 50%, how much more energy are we talking about? But I actually had no time to make a calculation here. But this will actually be an interesting point to see, like how big is the effect actually? Yeah, let's maybe this is something that one can do in the future, like take all the solar capacity that we have today and kind of upscale the efficiency to beyond 30% and see like how much more solar energy would be produced.
Yeah, at the current growth rate of basically solar
Very
panels.
simple calculation. You don't need to be too precise.
Yeah. Any other questions? Also, Martin, Marlon, really feel free to don't be shy. If you have any question, there is no stupid question. Feel free to just jump in.
I read, I think yesterday, that kind of for Northvolt, so kind of the Swedish battery manufacturer, that like obviously this is kind of the European play to kind of get build up significant kind of battery production, but that kind of Chinese companies were not directly forbidden to supply Northvolt, but kind of suddenly, as they announced kind of a big plant expansion, they were basically bottlenecked by supplies that were coming from China, because kind of the state companies were not delivering anymore to them. How's that for kind of perovskite solar cells? Is this kind of, if you take this as kind of, hey, this is the technology that European policy could kind of get behind in terms of like, let's build out our own independent supply base of this. Is this something that could be independent of kind of a Chinese supply chain, or is there kind of a critical component where like it doesn't matter if you kind of build up a decent chunk in kind of the manufacturing part, if kind of the rest of the supply chain, China is still 90% or whatever you had in those previous charts?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a very good question. I mean, when you look at this stack, I think you can still see my screen. Like,
yeah.
So the perovskite is like probably very independent. You're very independent here from that. That's my assumption. Yeah, my assumption would be that you're independent here from China. The top contact is an issue because current perovskite solar cells, they use gold or silver, and I think silver is also mainly mined in China, so that might be the main bottleneck. I don't know about this ITO stuff, where you get this from, but probably the electrodes are then an issue. The perovskite itself, I mean, it's always a question of scale. Like right now, probably you will not even find like where the perovskite is coming from, because it's on relatively small like research scales. But then once you scale it up, it's probably a bit more complicated. But I would assume that the top contact might be a bottleneck again, because you probably again use silver, and that's mined in China. And then, so I would say for the midterm, probably the most promising solar cells are these tandem solar cells with silicon, because silicon is so established. And then you can reach already very high efficiencies today. The tandem solar cells where you only have perovskite, they are still a little bit further away in terms of development. So I think like we would first see silicon perovskite tandem cells, then you have the silicon again. This is why, for example, Cubic PV, this US company, they build their own silicon cells. So they try to be independent of China as well. They don't buy it from China, they make it from scratch. I think for a pure perovskite solar cell company, if you can solve the top contact issue, then at least short to midterm, you should be relatively independent and be able to build up an independent supply chain.
Okay, nice, thanks.
Yeah, and then actually a question from Marlon about solar installation. From my understanding, most of the on-site installation is done manually by workers where we have a shortage. How do you estimate the opportunity to automate solar installation on fields, agri-PV or large roofs as much as possible with robots? One US company is Built Robotics.
It's a good question. Actually, I have not thought about this at all when I prepared the talk. Have not thought about this at all. It's a good question. Is there so he said there is a labor shortage for the guys who install it?
Yeah, that's actually Marlon's point. I think that is definitely true because we have in general, a handyman or a skilled labor shortage, and basically using robotics to install them on large roofs or also the fields in terms of agri-PV. I think just like one side, because I know someone working in the field, the agri-PV, I think they have bigger issues with even finding the right solar modules, and because the usual modules are too heavy for actually greenhouses. So they're looking for something that can be applied onto
they're too heavy.
glass. They're too heavy, really, in weight. Yeah, and of course they are. Yeah,
that's where perovskite would come in. Yeah,
exactly.
because they are much lighter. Actually,
exactly.
What I also heard is that this is a little bit going away from the question now, but it just fits to what you said. This kind of part that holds the solar cell is actually one of the most expensive components of a panel. Like, so not the cell itself, but like the I don't know how this is called, this bridge that is holding everything in place and is like distributing the weight. This is a expensive part, and this would actually is one of the reasons why perovskite panels can be so cheap, because they don't need to have this because they're much lighter. Coming back to the question, I think that's actually a very interesting point. I haven't thought about it. Wouldn't even, yeah, I think but it's like an interesting idea to do that. Not sure if it's something for first momentum, but interesting case.
Marlon also shared the link in the comments to the US company who's already doing this for anyone interested.
And I think also from, we had a couple companies in our funnel over time that kind of, or also just popping up in other areas as well, that are kind of trying to improve productivity, not directly kind of through robotics, but kind of productivity of the workers that are installing those panels, like from quality control, the whole kind of paperwork that you have to do around it, coordination, because it kind of takes different crafts to collaborate on a given site. So kind of trying to free up those workers to actually kind of install the solar panels and not fill out paper forms.
That would actually be a good question for Sebastian, because he's involved in the larger solar facilities.
Yeah, perhaps we can also like play this with him, and then also Marlon, I will get back to you. So, I mean, if there are no more questions, then already, Max, thank you so much. And I mean, we have 10 minutes left, so I would say whoever wants to stay in the call just for some chit chat, definitely feel free. But thank you, Max, already for this really interesting talk and also all the great questions. So next industry briefing will actually be on large language models. So hope we see you there as well. Stay tuned for the invite. This will be done by Nima, one of our new members to the investment team, but I guess as exciting and interesting as this one. Thank you so much. And as mentioned, whoever wants to stay for the last 10 minutes, I will be also staying in the call. Feel free to stay.